Welcome to the fourth video and final video in our long D3 Scatterplot build project. If you've been playing along at home, in the first video we looked at the design and the dataset that we were going to play with, and we also looked at how D3 version 5 loads with this new JavaScript thing called promises. In video 2, we tinkered a lot with scales and we did a lot of fine-tuning there. So that we could use scales in videos 3 and today in video 4. In video 3, we looked at axes and we put the axes on and we actually even animated them a little bit with a transition. Well, today, finally at long last, in this fourth video, it is time to plot some circles. And we're also going to create a little more interactivity. We're going to be able to show and hide the various dots that correspond to men and women. All right, so let's take a look at some code. Quick code recap plus a tour of what's new. We have been playing for a long time now with the D3 CSV load, and that's here in the code now. It's line 46. And we recall that what happens when it's loading the CSV file is that it creates what's called a promise. If that promise is fulfilled, then the then block at line 47 will be executed. This could get really big, so the strategy that we've employed is to use as many functions as we can to keep the then block reasonably manageable, right? And you can see what's happening, right? We're creating our scales, we're building the axes, we are adding labels to those axes, and now there's a new function here called draw circles. Draw circles starts at line 63, and if you review some of the stuff that we had talked about before about data binding, this is exactly perfect D3 data binding. So what we're doing when we load this new data set is we're selecting the SVG container, and then within that SVG container, we're selecting all of the circles that belong there. First time through, there aren't any. We bind that new data set that we just loaded, and we work with the enter data set. So there will be one new circle for every row, every array element in dataset. So for each one of those unbound data elements, we're creating a new circle, and now you can see where those scales are useful. We need to do some attributes. We need to attribute a CX property and a CY property to each circle, but the CX is simply our X scale of the year of that particular row in the dataset, and the Y element is simply the Y scale of the age. So that's perfect. The scale helps us out here a lot. Now, the other thing that I've done is I have created a class in the CSS that maps to the gender. So I want men and women to be color-coded slightly differently, and so we're just applying a class right there. If I look in my CSS, you can see it down here at the bottom. I have actually predefined some of the qualities of a circle. The radius should be 5. The stroke width is going to be 1. The stroke is going to be black. That is true for every circle. But now you'll see that I have a new class called F. So all of the women will have a fill color of CC6699. If you don't like that, you can play with it all you want. All the men are going to have a fill color of 6699 CC. Perfect. Well, let's take a look and see what happens. So here's my website as we left it. I'll just click refresh so that I make sure that I have the current version of the library loaded up, and we'll choose a new data set, maybe this one. Hey, there we go. It looks lovely. So the scales are drawing properly, the axes are drawing properly, all of the circles are coming in properly, and they're just color-coded. A little bit blue for the men and a little bit kind of red pink for the women here. That's great. Well, okay, because we know that we can load data sets dynamically, let's try another data set and see what happens. Yeah, that's the problem we had before, isn't it? Right. So the axes are shifting perfectly, but we've only added new circles to the SVG and we haven't gotten rid of the old ones. And I bet if we do this data set, well, yeah, there it is. We get the same problem. All right. So we need to think our way through this just a little bit more so that we know how to get rid of old circles before we add new circles. Brief review of data binding in D3. I like to think about data binding in D3 as a set of Venn diagrams. And so under the hood, that's actually not inaccurate. This is really close to what happens. So every time we do this, every time we do select all circle and bind to that set a new bunch of data, D3 actually creates 3 separate sets for us to work with. The circles that were already in the SVG container that continue to have presence in the data set go into this middle football shaped area. It's the intersection of those two sets, and I've just labeled that here SVG, but sometimes if you're reading the D3 literature, they'll call that the update set. But D3 creates 2 other groups as well. One is the enter group. The enter group are new data elements in that data set that are not yet represented in the SVG container. So if we want to add those, we will do what we just did, which is work with the .enter set, and then we'll append a circle, and we'll apply some attributes, etc., etc. The problem that we were just facing is that we didn't do anything with the other set, that there are old data elements who have circles in the SVG, but they're no longer in the current data set, and so they need to be removed. Now, the typical way to handle that is like this, right? In the left here for enter, we select all the circles, we bind our new data set, and then we work with the enter set, we append a circle, etc., 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 etc. We were just doing that. We could do, on the right-hand side, a similar thing for the exit set. Select all the circles, bind a new data set. Everybody who lost a row in the data set, we want to remove them, right? So we can work with the exit data set, but in this case, we'll be a little bit more radical. We're going to use the nuclear option here. So every time I load a new data set, what I would like to do is select the old circles and just get rid of all of them. Now, part of the reason that I want to do that is because our data sets are all disjoint. There's no overlap between our data sets. So I don't really need D3 to do some hard calculations about what's in the update set, what things go in enter, what things go in exit, etc., etc. So I'm going to be a little more harsh here. I'm just going to blow them all up. Here's our nuclear code. Now at the top of draw circles, I've just added 3 lines. I'm selecting the SVG container, then I'm selecting all the circles that exist in SVG and removing all of them. We'll start drawing circles with a fresh slate. So let's try this. Here's our schmozzle of dots as we left it. And let's reload that page and let's see if this works any better. So far, so good. Hey, there we go. That looks great. Now what happens is that we get rid of all of the dots and we load perfect circles every data set. And in fact, if we go back to the beginning, yeah, see, we're loading circles perfectly. And they're nicely color-coded. All right. Well, the next step now is going to be to connect to my data visualization these checkboxes up here. So I want men and women to be independently controlled so that my user can see both of those. Now, I think what I would like to have happen is when the page loads, I would like both of these to be checked. So when we load a new data set, it's pretty obvious to the user that they're looking at both dots for men and dots for women. And the first time they click on something, they will be turning off one or the other of those. And so they'll understand how to work with the interactivity. So the next steps are, I need to change the HTML so that these are checked when the page loads. And then I need to add an event handler to those checkboxes so that I can write some new JavaScript code to work with dots down here. Well, before we get too carried away, let's do a little flowchart, just so that we can be clear in our own heads about how this should work. So we already know on the right-hand side here that we've got an HTML select menu, and every time we change that, we're loading a new data set and we are drawing circles. So that load data is an event handler that has been attached to that HTML select menu. That part works. We're good. My question now is, how do I want my checkboxes on the left-hand side to work? So I've got one for check men and check women. How do I want that to go? One option is if I say uncheck the M box, the men box, one of the things I could do is select all of the men data elements and then exit remove them. And what that would mean then is when my user rechecks the men box, now I have to go out and somewhere I have to retrieve those original data elements and then rebind them, remerge them back into the original data set. Now, that's not impossible, and one of the things I could do is I could do a select, exit, remove, and then when I need to rebind, I could just start over at my change menu and I could call the load and draw event handler all over again. That's possible. But I think there's an easier way. Let's plan it this way instead. If I draw all of my circles, then if I go somewhere else to filter them, I can check the environment and see, what should I be looking at? Should I be looking at men, women, both, neither? And then what I could do is I could set a CSS style. And maybe all of you are already thinking about this. In CSS, I can actually attribute to any element a display of none. And then it becomes invisible. So what if I do this? What if I put a new class called invisible in my CSS and just attach that to every circle that doesn't have a checkbox? If that makes some sense, right? All right. So in that case, I think then probably these should be functions. And in fact, they will, and we'll see in just a minute. D3 actually has a function that's going to help us out. So these will be two functions, but they're not really going to be in that fashion. But we'll see that here in just a second. All right. How does that help me? Well, it helps me with my checkboxes. So now my checkboxes don't have to do anything with the data load. They don't have to do anything with exit. They don't have to do anything with enter. They don't have to do anything with update. They don't have to merge two data sets. They don't have to do anything. All they have to work with are CSSs. So if we uncheck a box, we add a class called invisible. If they recheck a box, we go back to all of those circles and we take away a class called invisible. Perfect. It's a very clean, easy solution. What else is nice now is that I need to attach an event handler to each of those two checkboxes. And in this case, now I can see where that should go. The event handlers for the checkboxes should just be this filter circles function. We don't have to do anything with the data set. We don't have to load a new one. We don't have to remove stuff. We don't have to add stuff. We don't have to do anything. All we're working with for these two checkboxes are CSS styles. That's easy. Let's look at the D3 that we can use here. D3 has a perfect function for the situation. It's called classed. What classed does is it either adds or removes a CSS class depending on whether we send it a true or false value. So what we will do is do a selection. We will take that CSS class from our CSS, and then we will decide whether to apply it or not. So just as a quick reminder, Our CSS is going to look something like this. We're going to have a class called invisible. Remember that dot in front stands for class. The hashtag means ID. The dot means class. So this is a class called invisible, and all it has is display none. And what we will do then is we will select all the circles in our SVG, and we will call classed. So classed will evaluate, hard to say, classed will evaluate every single circle and decide true or false should we apply the class invisible to that circle or not. Now, rather than hard coding in here true or false, what we're going to do is we're going to write a little filter function, and we will let that filter function return true or false depending on whether that circle should be invisible or visible. It will look a little bit like this. So here's a reminder. We're going to select all our circles. Should we or should we not attach the class called invisible? Well, we'll make our decisions this way. If the gender of that circle is M, and it's also true at the same time that that checkbox up in the top for men has no check mark in it, then the answer is true. Yes, please, we should apply the class invisible to that circle. Now, let's imagine this one. Let's imagine that the gender of that circle is F, and also true that the checkbox for women has no check mark in it. In that case, also, yes, please, return true and apply the class called invisible to that circle as well. Now, if any of those two things are false, if none of those hit and we fall through, so let's say the gender equals F, true, however, the women checkbox does have a check mark in it, then that conditional on line 2 there will be false and will fall through, so every other time return false. So anytime either men or women is checked, those conditionals will be false and we will not apply the class called invisible to those circles. However, when both of these conditions are true, equals men and men is unchecked, then we will apply the class called invisible. When the gender of that circle or that data point is female and women is unchecked, both of those conditions are true, then we will return true and we will, yes, apply the class called invisible to that circle as well. And the code. First, here's my CSS document, and you can see down at the bottom here, I just have a new class called invisible. Remember, dot means class, hashtag means ID. So invisible only sets the display to none, and all we're going to do is attach that or not attach that, as the case may be. I've made a little modification here in my HTML document, which we haven't seen for a while. But on those two checkboxes, I have added a property here called checked. And what that means is when the browser loads this page, it will in fact put check marks inside those boxes. That's exactly the way that I want this to start. And you'll notice that the IDs of these two checkboxes, the first one is men and the ID of the second one is women. I need those IDs to attach an event handler to these two checkboxes. And if I look in my JavaScript library, there they are right at the top in the event handler section. So I'm using D3 select to select those two IDs, men and women. I'm attaching to both of them the same callback function called filter circles. And I want filter circles to be executed every time the value of that box changes. Right? So let's scroll down a little bit and let's look at filter circles and then the filtering function itself. So the first thing I do in filter circles here at line 88 is I have to go get the values of those checkboxes. Now, I could have written that just as an if-else conditional, but I've used a different kind of structure here called a ternary operator. So hide men and hide women will either be true or false depending on the value of the following question. Is D3 select the item called men is that property checked or not? If it's true, then hide men becomes false. Else, hide men becomes true. So this is really, should I hide the men, yes or not? If there's a checkbox in that checkbox, if the checkbox is checked, then false. Don't hide men. Same for women. If there's a checkbox in the checkbox, false. Don't hide women. All right. And then what I'm doing is I'm just using D3 to select every circle in my SVG, and I'm calling classed, and I'm trying to decide whether I should attach the class called invisible or not. And here is my little callback function. My little callback function is to call gender filter with that particular row of CSV data. And you can see gender filter right below it here on line 95. The responsibility of gender filter is to send back either true or false, and it's written exactly the way that we were just doing it. So if the gender of that particular row happens to equal men, and hide men happens to be true, then return true. You'll notice that in JavaScript we don't actually have the keyword and like we would say in Python. And in JavaScript it's these two ampersands. That's what and means. So the other one is, if the gender is F and hide women happens to be true, then return true. Otherwise return false. Right? Now that is the callback function, but you remember in our flowchart we also had to do that after we draw our circles. So I have just added it right here. I'm just calling it immediately after we append all of the circles. Now that makes sense, and that's one place I could call it. If I wanted to, I could also come up here into my then block, and I could add filter circles immediately after calling draw circles. Either one is fine. That's fine. All right. Well, let's take a look at the page. So again, I'm just going to reload to make sure I have the newest version of my library in here. You'll notice men and women are both checked, so they should show up if I choose a data set, and in fact they do. Now, if I uncheck one of them, some of the circles go away. If I uncheck both of them, both of the circles go away, and they come back, which is great. Now, what should also happen is if I change the data set, because of the way that I've planned my code, I should just see the women in the new data set. And I do. And I do again. So this is working perfectly well. I can see all of the men. And if I uncheck everybody, they all go away, which makes complete sense. The data points are all still there. It's just that every single one of them now has a quality called invisible. And that's perfect. All right. Well, that's great. And that's the end of our entire walkthrough, building a D3 data viz from absolutely nothing into something that's sort of useful. I just wanted to point out two little things that we could do if we wanted to expand this. And one of them, and I hadn't really noticed this before, but you can see it in this final data set, which is that because in my CSV file, the only data I have for a date is the year. So when I zoom in close enough, everybody kind of goes in the same column like this. One of the things that I could do to make this a little bit better would be to go back to my original data set and put months and days back into that original data set. And then down below, instead of having a scale linear for my x-axis, I could actually have scale time, which would be great. One quick caveat. Before 1752, England used old style dates, not new style dates. So I'm going to let you go ahead and look that one up on Wikipedia. The other thing that I could do, if you remember, is that I had a lot of data that went beyond 1640. And now I am having a really nice ability to zoom in on the data. So one of the things I could do is now try to work with some of that data that I left behind way back in the first video. I might, for example, use a slider up here so that my users could choose the range of years that they would like to see, or maybe I could attach a zoom function as well. All of those are possibilities. So once you get one of these built, you probably are going to have a whole bunch of new ideas about things you can add to that to the project. For those of you in my class, I'll post this up on the Huco Dev server so that you guys can play with it and that you can look at the code as well. If you want to go further in your own projects, look at that Scott Murray book, Interactive Data Viz for the Web. He does a lot of things at the end of that book with things like maps and force-directed graphs and diagrams and all kinds of things. So there's a ton of extra stuff out there. But I hope you appreciated all of these 4 videos. I really wanted to show you under the hood how D3 works so that you can assimilate to how D3 thinks. And once you see how D3 thinks, the world's your oyster. You can start to build all kinds of really innovative new data visualizations. All right, well, thanks for all your time, and good luck with your own projects.